experiment was done with pea plants for several important reasons. Many varieties have easy traits to distinguish: color of flowers, color of pods, color of peas. The 7 traits he selected for study were known to disappear in one generation and reappear in the next. And I'll just say right here, the 7 traits he selected for study, he's a little bit lucky because those 7 traits were on 7 different chromosomes. Had they been on, any of them been on the same chromosome, he would not have gotten the same results. Because he picked these 7 traits on by luck, he didn't know they were on different chromosomes. He didn't even know what chromosomes were. But by luck, he picked these 7 traits. They followed these patterns, and he went with it. Pea plants are fast, small growing plants with a short life cycle, so he could do numbers of life cycles over and over again quickly and see lots of the results of lots of generations of pea plants. Imagine imagine doing this with a giant redwood which lives for 3,000 years. Probably be a little hard to come up with the same ideas, results that Mendel came up with using a plant that lives longer. So he used pea plants, quick turnover. You can get a couple of growing seasons in, maybe in the summer, 2, 3 maybe even, depending on the climate, and that would allow you more and more looks at how things are turning out. And self-pollination occurred, so all he had to do was remove the anthers so he could cross-pollinate, and which is called a crossing. So he could ensure that he had cross-pollination sometimes or self-pollinating at other times. They were easy to work with because they both had male and female parts. So if he removed the male parts, he could make sure that those particular plants were only crossed with other plants that he wanted to, and it wouldn't be just random in nature by bees floating around and so on. Couple of traits that he had here just to show you: tall versus dwarf, big T, little t. That's the most classic one that we see. Big T, little t is used a lot. Flower color of purple and white. A seed shape of spherical or dented, where the seeds are nice and round or they're kind of like shriveled up and dented. Seed colors used a lot too. Yellow, believe it or not, we used to green peas more here, but the dominant there was a yellow pea and the recessive was a green pea. The pod shape was easy to see. It would be puffy, inflated, or constricted so you could actually see where the seeds were. And finally, the pod color, green, was dominant, and yellow was recessive. Mendel's experiment. First of all, true breeding allows the plants to self-pollinate to assure pure traits. Now, this is something that's a little hard for some of you to understand, so let's really be sure about this. What he did was he self-pollinated tall pea plants for many, 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 many generations. Now, if you did this, you would expect that after 2 or 3 or 4 generations, if there were any little T's, little recessive alleles in there, eventually they would make their way, find another heterozygote with a little T, and you'd get some dwarf plants. But when he crossed these for many, many generations and only got 100% tall, he knew this was a pure big P, or big T, or as we're going to see, big S, for smooth peas and wrinkled peas. So he knew he had a purebred parental group that were all dominant. And he kept doing the same thing with recessives, but as he found out, once we understand this more, the recessives, of course, would be little t. They'd all be dwarfs or crinkled peas. Step 2, then he crossed the dominant, capital, with the recessive, little, to make the F1 generation. So he allowed the true breeding for many, many generations to ensure that he had a pure line of dominant and recessive parents. Then he crossed them, the dominant against the recessive, forced that cross, called the F1 generation. In this case, we have the smooth peas we're using as an example. Smooth peas are nice and round. They're dominant. Wrinkled can only happen when it's little s. So the parental generation, after many generations of crossing, he knew was guaranteed to be big S, crossed with little s. They each can only make one kind of a gamete, a dominant gamete on the left and a recessive gamete on the right. They put them, when they mated and produced offspring, we ended up with a big S, little s, F1 generation. They were all smooth because smooth is a dominant trait. So even though all of the individuals in this generation, he didn't know this at the time because he didn't know about chromosomes, but he called these things factors. There was a dominant and a recessive factor in every plant in that generation. And then he allowed them to self-cross. We had big and little crossing with big and little, and we ended up, then we see this situation where a big and a little gamete and a big and a little gamete form. And what are the possible results of a cross like this? Well, if we cross a big and a big, we'll get a big. We cross a big and a little, we get a hetero, big little. A big and a little, another hetero. And finally, over in the corner here, a little and a little gives us a recessive. So, in the self-pollinated groups, the offspring are called the F2. The dominant traits, the smooth, and the recessive, it disappears in the F1, but it reappears in the F2. Generation that we're seeing here in this chart is the F2. And it will be smooth, smooth, smooth to crinkled or wrinkled. So what we have here is a 3-to-1 ratio. We started off with 50% tall, or 50% smooth and 50% wrinkled in the first cross. In the second generation, in the F1, they were all smooth, and then the wrinkled seeds came back in the F2 generation, and it can be explained easily by this little chart, because both of the F1s have to be heteros. A big and a little gamete is going to be produced by each plant if they self-pollinate. We're going to end up with one that's a dominant homozygote, two that are heterozygotes, and one that's a homozygous recessive. Each trait has two factors. One comes from the mother, one comes from the father. Here's his theory of heredity. Each copy or each of these are called an allele. Allele for smooth or an allele for wrinkled. The two alleles that an individual have may or may not be the same. Again, if they're the same, they're homozygous. If they're different, they're heterozygous. And remember, a recessive can only show up in a recessive, homozygous recessive situation. And again, the phenotype is what it looks like, and the genotype are what genes are actually there.